Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, to the Praise of Flight podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook, and support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. And also don't forget to check out my Substack, where you can get both free articles and articles behind a subscription wall. This is the second episode where Logos and I go through my speech and sort of tease out a lot of the complexities that people were asking me to explain more and revisit more. And today is going to be the tension between conservatism and libertarianism. So it's all yours, Logos.
All right. So the first one was really, really important because it set the stage for everybody. TLDR, quick recap. The underlying thing for all of this is Todd's view that society is basically crumbling. We're on a self-destruct sequence. There's no really getting out of it. And so when we're talking about how should conservatives think about the economy, or how should conservatives think about education, what we don't want to think is how can conservatives take the institutions back from an empire that's more or less dying. That's just the wrong way to think about going about this whole project. And what we need to be thinking about this in terms of is parallel institutions. And that's going to basically motivate everything that's going to go on going forward. Okay, so when thinking about libertarians, the reason why they come up, of course, is because they're viewed as fellow travelers in a lot of the conservative spaces. I haven't gone to like Old Glory Club and Shillings and all these other events like Todd has, but Todd has told me about them, and there are definitely factions within the events, one of which being the more libertarian right faction, and they're just kind of like there. But given what Todd talked about in his speech, the question is, if we're trying to make like a pan-conservative movement rather than a dissident, non-left-leaning movement, the question is, should they be in what capacity? So the first thing that motivates the question, especially from Todd's speech, is the origins of the culture war. So Todd takes a very corporate view of what's going on. You can look at the corporate angle during the Cold War, how they worked with the CIA. You could look at what happened to the Occupy movement in recent history and how corporations, government, and all these other entities have kind of created these cultural counter gangs to keep people distracted. That's basically front and center in what Todd's talking about. And so this gets back inevitably to a right-wing question about the economy. Instead of, let's phrase this in a way that doesn't single out the libertarians completely. Let's say something like this. If voluntary transactions lead to a centralization in corporate power that could end up with something like Rockefellers or Soros or whoever you want, at the end of it, is that type of voluntarism in principle consistent with the conservative and reactionary principles in society that the group is trying to bring about? I think that is a pretty neutral statement of the issue that doesn't like harp on libertarians, qua libertarians. What really seems to be the issue to me is the voluntary nature of the economy. People doing voluntary transactions can result in all sorts of market forces, which may be outright terrifying if they go too far in certain directions. And so the question is, do you let voluntarist forces run amok in the market? That is like the central question. So
yeah. So there's a lot that we can unpack here, but let's also first distinguish between two types of libertarians. And we made this discussion before, Logos. There's a sort of like just sort of leave me alone kind of attitude, which naturally finds a home in the libertarian movement because that's sort of a demographic they really cater to. Whereas there's another kind, which is like, I get to be as antisocial and do whatever as I do whatever I want, no matter who it, offends. Or even Murray Rothbard denounced those people as the model libertarians, the MLs, the angsty Randroids. But they are hugely influential in the libertarian movement, and even in the circles that Rothbard associated with. So those people are definitely out. The question then becomes, the people that just want to be left alone or take a more, I'm opposed, I'm socially conservative, I'm opposed to the war in Iraq. That's sort of where like I was like in 2005. Yeah, those are a different group of people, which I think needs a different attitude. But broadly speaking, As a whole, though, libertarianism, is in favor of deregulation of businesses, is in favor of all of these things. Now, there's several contradictions that never get teased out. On the one hand, you're going to hear libertarians say that, under a truly libertarian society, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, and the Fords wouldn't exist because we wouldn't have all these privileges and monopolistic qualities, and we wouldn't have limited liability corporations. And yet, every single one of these people, when they go into business, starts an LLC in order to do business in the market, even though they're like, LLCs wouldn't exist in a truly libertarian society. And it's like, well, okay, well, which is it? And then when any action, but then of course, when the government tries to say break up Rockefeller, they defend Rockefeller as a victim of government aggression. Well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Which is it? Did he get, if he got to power with the help of government privileges, then this is just, the price you have to pay for, playing the game? Or is he a entrepreneurial hero who's being oppressed by the mean government? I've heard Lou Rockwell, for example, take both sides. The whole Lou Rockwell Institute website has been on both sides of that question, so I don't really know what that means. The other thing is, it's assuming that the market as we know it, or the market as it has existed at various stages in history, is some fixture of nature. So, one could imagine a scenario where, you're on the Silk Road right before one of the empires that keeps it going falls. And you comfort yourself that the caravans are as consistent as the stars in the sky and the seasons. And then the empire falls and there's no more caravans. And then everybody was like, well, that was stupid. Why did we think that commerce was an essential quality of nature? And then they build it up again, and now we're here, right? We're here now. We think the same way that it's an essential quality of nature, when it's not, when we know it's not. So there's a sort of weaselly game going on here that, so for example, if we're having to deal with like a hurricane or a wolf pack or famine, well, that's just things we have to deal with. We don't get to decide to opt out. That's just the reality we live in. Having to deal with multinational corporations that manipulate the culture and create planned obsolescence and manipulate us to buy things that we don't need by generating demand to avoid the problem of overproduction, that is not anything like having to deal with a flood or navigating the sea in a sailboat. And it's a completely dishonest argument to say that it is. So in that case, it isn't voluntary, right? It's a system that was constructed and imposed on us that we have to do business in. And again, we get a two out of both sides of the mouth response, right? Murray Rothbard will say, and other libertarians will say, they've even quoted Marxists like Gabriel Coco. Oh yeah, sure. We admit that, corporations externalize the cost of protecting private property to the government, to the taxpayer via police, right? They don't have to pay out of pocket for all their estates. That's covered by the cops, which is us. But then when you point out the unfairness of it, and that maybe they should then pay some of that back to the society as a whole, they say, oh, that's socialism. Well, okay, but it's okay when they have the cops do, and then they'll say, well, no, it's not, but they won't do anything about it. So it's like, I just question in principle that this is voluntary at all. It isn't. It's superimposed on us, and it's enforced by the state. And they say that, but then on the other side of their mouth, they'll act like it's some fixture of nature, like the seasons or the stars. And it's like, well, no, it's not. You can't say both of those things. And I guess the other thing too, and is that, while it might be voluntary. Okay, so we're talking about conservatives here, right? Well, Rothbard is infamous for saying that parents have a right to starve their children because they can just voluntarily choose to not do so. A voluntaristic society eventually becomes Kronos devouring its own children and just dies. And so that's not really anything a conservative would want anything to do with.
Right. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot there. I think narrowing this down, let's narrow this down a little bit to the project we have in mind, because we talk a lot about the history, Rockefellers, the government, so on and so on and so forth. Let's just really get in the mindset of what we talked about last time. We're building a parallel community. We're starting over as the empire falls. And I think what we're worried about is the seed of libertarianism as a principle kind of taking root in these new parallel societies. So let's talk about why that specifically might be an issue. So if people just get to voluntarily transact however they want to transact, what principles would this could this not work well within the community? So for example, you mentioned before we got on the stream that you want commons in the community, that there should be resources in common. You want there to be talent nurturing as a community project, like find talented people, make a concerted effort to get them into positions, so on and so on. And so it seems to me, like at a base philosophical level, the problem you're having is that libertarians have this kind of spontaneous order view where everything's voluntary, all transactions are voluntary, everybody will just kind of figure it out for themselves and we'll muddle through and get it. Whereas you want to go back to a much more ancient way of doing things where everything is in some sense everybody else's business. We live and die together as a community, and that basically that view of community as an us entity is fundamental to your idea of conservatism. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. Because, first of all, we can just look at what the word community means, like etymologically, right? It means, so it comes from the Latin communitatium, which means fellowship, community of relations, or feelings. Now, all but how do you have those things? Well, one of those things is you have things in common, right? So you have, right, so what's often said is that a family is run in the Marxian sense of from each according to his ability, each according to his need, because obviously toddlers and infants and young children can't be expected to do these things, so they still have to be provided for, right? Otherwise you wouldn't have anything. So on the one hand, what does it mean to be a community? What has to be held in what has to be common? Because here's the thing, as it's pretty clear now, at least, that if you don't have a common source of income, a common source of living space, you can't really enforce community norms, because people are just like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do it. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to tell them? How are you going to compel them to conform to the norms? Well, you can't. And the other thing too, Logos, you and I have already proven this actually using Rothbard and Hoppe's arguments. If you're going to argue that we need to have a certain baseline of rights, like property ownership rights, in order to ensure that man, because right, Rothbard sounds very Randian at times, right? Man survives by using his reason to create goods and services that he can consume and sell. And the argument goes, well, without the right to property, then we don't have the right to those things. Right, but that's a necessary entailment is the right of education. Because if you don't have an education, you don't have a mind to use. Therefore, the entire thought experiment falls apart. And yet they're never going to say that there's a right to education, even though that would naturally follow from the arguments. We did this when we did our argument where we broke down Rothbard, Kinsella, and Hoppe.
Oh, I remember.
The other thing is, this is just clearly a waste. I mean, case in point is myself, right? The idea that I have to find this weird little cash nexus hoop to jump through before I get what I need to be an academic is just ridiculous. That shouldn't have been the case. And, there are many other talented people that are in this boat. And we see that if that's taken care of, let's use a mundane example that won't scare people. The medieval monasteries. I think one of the things that can be said about the more recent Catholic apologetic is that the medieval monasteries, even though they were run on communistic lines, were quite effective at providing goods and services, whether that ranged from medical to education to even agricultural improvements, as well as innovations such as like genetics with Mendel. So, but why? Well, it makes sense, right? All the monks have all their physical needs met. They don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep, where they're going to get their food, and they can just spend their time theory selling. And, well, what do you know? You actually get a lot of really cool stuff when you do that, rather than having them toil away in the fields like serfs, not having that opportunity. So it's just not really a good way of organizing human capital. And we see this again and again. So the point that I'm getting at here is when you have the conservative is trying to argue in favor of a community. You can't have a community when people are economically independent of each other. That's pretty clear right now that you can't really get by with that. And so you then have to have something in common. And we also see that in a pre-modern sense. Now, granted, obviously, a monastery, they're all celibate, so that's not really a family situation. But we do see that a lot of really important work can be done in a way that, quote unquote, violates the tragedy of the commons argument that you'll often hear. And then furthermore, just throughout society, whether you look at like a Celtic village, in ancient Gaul, or even a Greek city-state, Aristotle talks about the polis having things in common, or medieval English village. That's just how it was run. And if you don't like that and you're going to call that socialist, I don't know what to say. That just sounds like to me that anything that isn't radical free market capitalism is socialist, including what we would have otherwise considered conservative in the past. And then this sort of illustrates an old Arabian proverb: if the camel once gets his nose in the tent, his body will soon follow. So the conservative movement made this alliance with the libertarians around 2008 with Ron Paul, and the libertarians didn't become more conservative. The conservatives became more libertarian.
Yeah, that's a good point. And there's lots of points that we'll transition into. I think a way to summarize this part of the talk and kind of put a bow on it would be something like this. It seems to me that the fundamental cornerstone of your conservatism is the idea of community. And fundamental to the idea of community is that there is something that binds people in common such that the community can expect certain labors from each other, whether it be education, that their kids be educated, whether it be food. I don't know the full extent of that, could be a stream in its own, but there are certain basics that as a member of the community you expect from others, and you have things that others are going to expect from you. Whereas the fundamental principle of libertarians, which is why they'd say like education's not a right, is that you never have a right or an expectation to the labor of somebody else. Any situation in which you do have that entitlement, you're basically treating somebody like a slave. It's a slave relationship, right? You hear this with education, healthcare, so on. And this is the fundamental disagreement and vision between your two camps, more or less. Does that sound like a putting a bow on it?
Yeah, no, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. So now we can move on. So let's talk again practicality. We talk theory on this channel like most of the time, and so just like in the first one, I want to talk about theory, or I want to talk about action, because that's what this conference is about, and really highlighting the speech is about. So as we make the transition to the society you're talking about, we are talking about doing this in a principled way that would kind of exclude libertarians if people have like this vision for what you're planning. And so I guess the immediate question we're going to be faced with from libertarians especially is, well, look, you guys are wanting to start a voluntarist project of separating from everybody else, separating from mainline US institutions and so on. And we are kind of like the voluntarist guys. So why aren't we in on that, even if we might disagree with some principles? And you have one response that you've given, the camel analogy, and the relationship between libertarianism and conservatism before, right? It's like, if we bring you along, how do we know that once certain people start winning in the marketplace and they start doing some Rockefeller stuff, they bring in Kinsey 2.0 and whatever, how do we know you won't be like, well, everything was voluntary, what's the problem? Guess that's just what we gotta accept, guys, right? That's one issue from it. And the other issue, it seems to me, is what we're going to talk about later with the cash nexus and how people are viewed to interact with each other. But let's quickly talk about the first one first.
Yeah.
Go into the seeds of libertarianism. Why in principle would it be dangerous to kind of like bring them along in the same way it'd be dangerous for us to hitch ourselves to MAGA?
Well, I mean, we could just use conquest law, right? Instead of saying, the right drifts left, we could say the right drifts libertarian. Now, you and I have both said libertarians are a form of leftists, so I guess that's still conquest law after all, isn't it? But the other thing is we also I want to again refer to the original distinction between like the model libertarians who are the obnoxious randroid types who just want to do whatever they can, be as obnoxious as possible because they can, because they have the money, because they have the right. Even though Rothbard criticized them, he didn't quite purge them from the group, and they're going to be a problem no matter what. But there are a lot of people that don't like the wars in the Middle East, don't like the government being super intrusive, and they just kind of get caught up in this libertarian net. Some of them, call themselves libertarians, but that's only because, I think they're like a 1 or 2 issue person. And if they could find another avenue to express those 1 to 2 issues, they might be willing to change. So in that regard, they would be a different person altogether than the non-ideological libertarians, I guess I'd say. And then we can also make a distinction between levels of relationship. I mean, we could, theoretically, one could do business with them. One, like work on a shared goal to achieve some sort of shared vision. But that would be on a case-by-case basis, because the long-term danger is if you take their money, they end up having a stake in how they run you. That's how corporations run the country in the first place. And so, yeah, that's what I'd say practically.
Okay, so that off to the side, hopefully that'll give the libertarian members of your audience that I know exist something to think about here. We've preempted some of their disagreement. Let's get into, I guess, the next real phase of the discussion then, the cash nexus, because I know you want to talk about Carlyle, and this is implicit throughout your speech in terms of how conservatives should integrate with culture, each other. Even when you brought up that quip near the end about, technology for the betterment of us versus technology for like the betterment of like the machine, using your Middle Earth analogy, it seems there's going to be something about that here. So to see if I can summarize it briefly as I understand it, right? A cash nexus is something where people's value ends up being determined, their social status, what they bring to the community, is summarized by the money in their bank account. Because the money in their bank account is supposed to be some kind of abstraction for what they've done for the community. So you do a bunch of favors, you get paid for those favors, you have a bunch of money. So it's kind of like what the community owes you. The issue with the cash nexus is, as a society gets more and more complicated, it's not clear how people make their money. It's not clear exactly what they've done for you or for the community to make their money. And so it's not clear what the community owes them for, or if the cash amount is worth it. This is especially true as you talk about the virtue nexus as being juxtaposed with the cash nexus, right? Just because the community owes you, favors for this money you have, did you do virtuous things to get that money, such that the community isn't making a deal with the devil in their owing you this thing? So there's a level of abstraction, the abstraction of money from virtue, the abstraction of cash taking the place of explicit social bonds. There's a problem of technique that you've brought in other conversations, and how technology, the complication of society, has kind of gotten the ways that make us human and give us human interactions. I think that's my initial summary. What do you have on to add?
Yeah, so I would say that's, I think, broadly correct. I mean, I'm not saying I disagree with anything that you've said, but this is how I'm going to define as concisely as possible the cash nexus. Let's imagine 3 different institutions: the family, the church, and the state. All of them are considered to be distinct and different from a corporation and market forces. And they all are supposed to relate to you, the individual, and each other in ways that are determined by their organizational nature. What the cash nexus does is it replaces everything with the corporate relation. So whether you're dealing with the corporation, the government, the church, the family, it's all the same. And the rest are just facades to create the illusion that there's still a difference in society. So how's that look, guys?
Okay, yeah, that's one aspect I didn't quite capture in the complicating or simplifying, depending on your perspective, of social bonds. Yeah, I think that's right. Because we should think that there's some quality about family relations that's different from church relations, that's different from these other kinds of relations. But again, as what's in our bank accounts becomes synonymous with our value to society, all those intangible and old obligations kind of slip away with it. So yeah, I think that's an important note to add.
So because no, that doesn't mean that what you said isn't entailed in the definition, but I feel like what makes it hard for people to understand the cash nexus is there's a lot of ways in which there's knock-on effects, and it's easy to talk about the knock-on effects. Very easy. But if someone's not familiar with the idea, then it's like, well, okay, but like what do these knock-on effects represent? And so you're going to then end up relating to these things as assuming that if you look at the family, the church, and the state, the government, you relate to them assuming that they are what they are and that you expect to get either advancement or reward or something from them by relating to them that way. But as we've seen in the modern American context, that's not how it works. Because what you're not doing is you're not relating to them through the cash nexus. But the cash nexus doesn't want to be seen for what it is. It's a kind of Baudrillardian simulation where I'd argue it's a level 2 simulation because it's hiding what's there. It's hiding the fact that the church and the state and the family are just facades for cash relations, rather than, say, the family might be a relation of natural affection. The church might be the relation of, divine affection, agape, God's love for us and each other. And then the government might be the relation of justice between individuals, regardless of their ability to pay. Hence why the Constitution gives you a right to a lawyer, whether you can afford one or not. All of that goes out the window, right? They're no longer there. What actually is there is just cash relations that are being hidden. So it's a level 2 simulation. And so this is really bad for a lot of reasons, and why the conservatives keep losing. And why I actually think that George Watson in the Lost Literature of Socialism makes a very interesting case. In a video, I talked on this last week, that socialism was initially a right-wing reaction to capitalism. So, yeah, if you want to see any more, just watch that video. That's literally the title, so it won't be that hard to find. This idea, as we get it, first comes to us from Thomas Carlyle. I think there's a couple interesting quotes from his that are worth reading. Chartism, 1840, cash payment, the sole nexus, and there are so many things which cash will not pay. Cash is a great miracle, yet has not all the power in heaven nor even on earth. And that's another thing the cash nexus does. There are certain, when I say goods here, I don't mean economic good to be consumed, but a moral good or a social good. There are certain goods that just don't get produced because you can't put a price on them. One would be, I would actually argue you could say a certain kind of innovation. I mean, obviously we've had technological innovation because you can profit off that, but we don't have like philosophical innovation anymore. And I think that's because that's something that's really hard to quantify, really hard to put a price value on. So we just don't get it, or the production of high art. I mean, high art just isn't being produced anymore because it doesn't fit within the cash nexus. When an aristocrat who's, as an aesthete just wants to have his favorite painter paint him a new painting, he's not doing it because of its market value. It might have market value in hindsight, but that's not why he produced it. This is from Past and Present, 1843. That laissez-faire, supply and demand, cash payment for the sole nexus and so forth are a joint and will never be a predictable law of union for a society of men. And coldly sing the all-conquering valiant sons of toil, still enchanted by the million and the poor law Bastille, as if this were nature's law, mumbling to ourselves some vague janglement of laissez-faire, supply and demand, cash payment, the one nexus of man to man, free trade, competition, and devil took the hindmost, our latest gospel yet preached as if in truth there were no god of labor, as its godlike labor and brutal mammonism were convertible terms. The other problem with the cash nexus is it just basically screws people who come in later. In a way that, say, what I'm going to propound now, the virtue nexus doesn't. Virtue is what you do. So you could be butt broke and still be virtuous and have a place in the virtue nexus. There's really no way for certain people beyond a certain point to enter the cash nexus once it gets rolling, because the barrier to entry gets higher and higher and higher. You end up having this dissolution effect. And we've seen this throughout history before. This is merely the most extreme case. I would argue I would replace this with the virtue nexus, where exchange of goods and services is based not upon one's ability to generate monetary value in the market, but based on some prearranged agreement of what it means to be an ethical, moral person and how near or far you are to that. And the amount of services and goods you get from society are dependent upon your mastery of that quality. It's a measurable quality. So, for example, in the same way that someone who trains in some sort of sporting event, you can tell if they're a novice or a master by one, seeing how much training they've done, seeing them perform the particular feat that they were attempting to perform. And in a similar way, once you've understood and defined what virtue is, you can say someone who's a novice to someone who's a master. But what's different here is that you don't need money to do it. And in fact, you could be totally broke. And there are Socrates and Confucius would, have people that didn't have money, and because that wasn't needful, right, to get in. Only willing to put in the effort. And so what a virtue nexus economy would prevent is this sliding scale where people just get priced out over time, which then leads to a massive unemployed urban proletariat, which leads to the collapse of the system, and which we've seen throughout history. So that's what I'd say about that.
Okay, to wrap this section up, there are two ways I want to tie this back to your speech. The first way I think that might be interesting is how this ties back into what the culture war is. This might be a little bit of a curveball, but see if you can follow me for a second. I'm reminded of a conversation we had about you talking to some church people about, let's say, abortion. It could have been any political topic, but I think one of the ones you happen to be talking to them about is abortion. Major culture war issue, right? What you are trying to impress upon these people who are, asking your advice on this and how they could, engage with this in their congregation and deal with it politically, you told them they need to think about ways to empower people in the community to resist the problem financially, because a big part of, say, abortion is how many women want to have kids, how many women want to date guys that are just starting out, versus the sociological average of like 7 years, female hypergamy, so on and so forth. That adds all these tensions, right? So the way you put it to the people you're talking to is, how can the church empower the community to actively start families and value their children? And I don't remember exactly what you said about that conversation, but they didn't value that advice very much. And so this gets at the cash nexus way the culture war, the counter-gang nature of the culture war is established. Conservatives very often want to deal with the abstract nature of cultural problems. We'll just use abortion for an example, by making slogans or fighting it in the Supreme Court or, whatever. But they don't want to have community-specific ways of addressing the problem because they don't look at it as a community-centered symptom of a community problem. And so that's one way I think this thing you're bringing up actually ties back directly into your speech about how and why the culture war is as abstract and unwinnable as it is, because dealing with it in a way that would give it any sort of finality would involve a radical reshifting of how we look at the root causes of the problems.
Yes. Well, to put it another way, the culture war is a Baudrillardian simulation facade for the fact that all of this is just cash exchange as a form of social relation.
Yeah, and the other quick thing I wanted to do before we jump to the last section was talk about tech. So again, I think so some people have been really confused, me included at times, about your distinction in technology in your speech. Dave talked about this a lot when he was reviewing it, and this is the technology of the elves versus the technology of Mordor, I think was the example used, right? How there are technologies that can help man be virtuous and do what man needs to do, and there are technologies that just kind of like feed the machine and turn people into cogs. I think this cash nexus idea is a way of kind of thinking about that technological distinction. We'll talk about technology specifically in a future one, but could you talk to the audience about how that distinction might really relate to this cash nexus idea in particular?
Right. So let me reiterate briefly what I mean by that. There's two ways in which you can look at, quote, elf magic and Mordor magic: the internal nature of it to the user and the individual, and then its external effect. both of which are important in the definition. So elf magic, this is an inherent property that you just have that ultimately you can't lose because it's an inherent property of you. What will be things that and then furthermore, that is then used towards improving or strengthening other people's wills in order to get them to where you're at, more or less, right? You don't just have this gift that you've got for yourself, you then give it to them. What might be like practical modern examples? Well, someone who gains strength by weightlifting, someone who knows how to play an instrument, somebody who knows how to sing, someone who knows how to think rationally. All of these are inherent capacities that you don't lose when you lose the tool. Now, obviously, you might need a tool, like if you're going to play an instrument or lift a weight. But if you're going to sing or think, you don't need a tool. I mean, your body's the tool, so unless your body gets maimed, it's intrinsic to who you are. It's not something that you use. It's that it is you. Mordor magic is something that you use in order to dominate and control others. So, for example, when Sauron loses the ring, his entire existence is destroyed along with the ring because his own, that's who he was. Now, initially, he wasn't that way. He had elf magic, but he eventually gave it up over time, as did his master Morgoth. And then he uses that to then bulldoze other people's wills. That's Tolkien's terminology. So what the cash nexus does is it gives the illusion of power to the men that are in it, even though they're completely incidental to it. And if they got spit out the next moment, they'd be completely useless and no one would listen to them. We all know this is the case because why don't boomers retire? Why is it that we have the euphemism from Mark Twain? It's difficult to get a man to accept a proposition if it goes again, if he has a vested economic interest in not believing it. Because the guy knows if he loses his job, he's a nobody. And he doesn't want to be a nobody. So we all know this is the case. It's one giant conspiracy that we're pretending it's not the case. Whereas Ulysses, who has elf magic, who's a king, who has actual prowess and ability, could be a wandering vagabond for 10 years, and it doesn't affect who he is. Everybody looks at him as like, yeah, you're a king, you're a prince, you're a nobleman. He lost all of the trappings, but it didn't change his fundamental relation to the rest of the world. In the same way that a guy who might be a CEO and, gets kicked out of his position as a corporate and then falls all the way down into the gutters, well, nobody gives a crap about him.
Yeah, another dimension that occurs to me as well is if you have a cash nexus society, you stop thinking about the people in the society as individuals, and you start thinking about them as just basically wells of cash. How much cash do they have? So how much they care about their opinion? How much cash can I get from them? How much cash am I minimally obligated to give to them? And so when you have technologies that are made purely around extracting, maneuvering, moving about the cash and who owns what in society, you could think of that as like a very Sauronite technology, because in some sense in a cash nexus society, your cash is a representative of your will, which you can extract from others because they owe you and so on. You pay money, you get services. And so technologies that focus on moving that about are technologies that in aggregate affect the wills of other people in that sense. Whereas what you're talking about, I think, in the virtue nexus is you're talking about technologies and ways of looking at social relations that are individual focused. Instead of thinking about people as like a well of cash that happens to be distributed in a pie, you're thinking about the people as the people. What can they do? What are they good at? How can they help the community? How can the community help them like achieve those goals? And so you'd probably want technologies that are used to facilitate finding these people, training these people, helping them better themselves, and ways in which the people can use their own capacities to make everybody's lives better. And so in aggregate, that I think is a philosophical distinction you're looking for.
Right, and there's another practical knock-on effect too, right? So we already mentioned earlier in this discussion that the latecomers get really screwed over in a cash nexus society, which eventually creates an urban proletariat, which creates instability, which brings down the cash nexus. And I also mentioned the CEO that is just he just self-owns and he falls to the bottom and nobody cares about him anymore. That won't happen in a virtue nexus society, because even if you do fall to the bottom, like Ulysses, you are already equipped with the tools to climb back up. And also you have people who recognize you for who you are. Oh, you are this capable, talented person. Maybe you just had a string of bad luck. And so there's a much easier chance of getting back to where you were if through some mischance you fell.
Yeah, I think that about summarizes that section. So for the last section, let's talk, I guess, about again moving from the theory of the cash nexus into the practicality of the cash nexus. Um, so you're going to start this parallel society. That's the idea, is you have all these parallel societies, these basket weaving societies, starting their own sorts of localized parallel institutions, and so on and so forth. How can they manage their social relations? Okay, let me do this way. The point of cash is that barter economies get really hard and really complicated really, really fast, because the more goods the economy can produce, the harder it is to figure out how to trade one good for another good. It might be easy if, I have good A, you have good B, we'll figure something out. But once you have like 12 goods and we need bunches of them to survive in various quantities, the exact barter can get very, very difficult and complicated, lots of moving parts, lots of middlemen, etc. Cash smooths that over. That's kind of like the point. And so there's some degree in which I think most people understand that cash is kind of like an outcome of a reasonably complex society. And so, what is the practical way we can think about how to balance society being complicated enough to do all the things we would need it to do while still being, I don't know, eschewing cash as the sole arbiter of value for these more complex dimensions?
Well, I mean the the cheeky answer is it's already been done. That's what the Greeks and Romans did in their heyday before they were corrupted by oligarchies. And then, of course, the question then becomes, okay, well, how do you prevent the corruption of the oligarchy? That's a separate question altogether. But what happens is when you have, so the way I envision a virtue nexus society is, if we view, this is where, of course, someone who values maximal human liberty, whether you be an anarchist or a libertarian, you're not going to like. Aristotle said that man's appetites and desires are infinite, and is therefore impossible to satisfy them. So they must be educated to be happy with less. Now, the one who gets the most is, because there's a sense in politics. There was a pope, I forget, who was elected precisely because he didn't want to be pope, which means he's perfect for leadership. Right? He doesn't actually want the job, which is why he's great for it, because when it's his time to step down, he'll step down and he'll do a good job when he's chosen. The people that get the money, that get the most of the money, are going to end up being the ones that don't really want it. And that's because they're going to be the ones that are going to be the ones safest using it. I mean, in a certain regard, if you're thrifty, if you're hardworking, if you're able to network, it is going to just happen that you'll make money and you'll gain influence and power. That's just what happens. The problem is, who do we give these things to? Right? There was a German liberal author that libertarians like to push around, who said that in socialism the worst people rise to the top. Not that like it just it selects for the worst. I think Hayek made a more modest claim that, well, just through bad incentives the worst rise to the top. Well, I think in many ways that's what a cash nexus does. It chooses the worst, because avarice was considered even throughout the Middle Ages and throughout all of history one of the worst vices that you could indulge in, and those are the people that get to the top, and the results were more or less predictable. And so resources, I mean, most people could actually get by on a lot less than they think they do. And so part of this argument has this baked-in assumption that we need to have a constantly growing economy producing more goods and services. I'm saying we don't want that. And a lot of the complexity of the market's going to go away when we just streamline things and meet basic human physical needs, and just have it like in a monastery, and it's just fixed. And then we can focus on the higher things: art, literature, music, spirituality, things like that. In which case, we won't really be organizing as complex of an economic system. Now, we might have other complex systems, maybe political, maybe be institutional. But I think that that's a different question entirely, because they've existed long before the cash nexus. We know how to organize those things.
Okay, try to summarize what I've just heard a little bit. So it sounds like cash as such isn't a problem. Society can become moderately complex without being too complex. So pre-oligarch Greece probably had a level of complexity that kept it stable, and then something happened, around the time of the rise of oligarchs that made society so complex that people were able to get rich off of abstractions, and that's when things in society started shifting. Um, and so, if we're looking at one of these new right-wing communities that are burgeoning after the fall of our society, it seems like for a good chunk of their initial startup, they won't be too complex. This will be a problem. Okay, so here's a way I think we can make this practically applicable. What is the biggest warning you can give to communities that they might be in danger of making their economies too complex? They might be in a transition. So I'll venture a guess first, real quick. So my guess might be of what you might say, and you might have another one, is empire. So societies start getting corrupt and corruptible and becoming oligarchs when you start getting empire, because things abstract. You're not just looking at your society, you're now looking at the roads, the trade routes, the global order. And if all that stuff starts mattering equally to the economy as the lives of your neighbors next door, then in some sense your social radius, your spheres of responsibility, that's the term, your spheres of responsibility start getting blended together. It's hard to focus on your local sphere of responsibility when everything's equally important in maintaining the global economy to make sure you don't go into a recession and the empire has hegemony and trade works and so on. So it seems like the broad warning to me would be new burgeoning communities should look out for transitory states that start blending the spheres of responsibility so that you're not getting what you should be getting, your family, your neighbors, your church, etc. But everything's blended out to where everything matters, because once that matters, the economy is so complex that you have very, very rich people managing this complex network that can then profit off of it in very unhealthy ways.
Yeah. Yeah, but as you ask that question for a reclarification, I think there's a better way to clarify this. If you have a unified and agreed upon concept of virtue prior to the production or consumption of any good or service, in this case, I mean in the economic sense, you were already going to have in the mind of the individual consumer this idea of its broad relative value to everything else, right? Because you've already constructed this formal system of virtue and allocated things in there. Okay, so I would argue in such a society, see, because right, part of the problem with cash, part of the reason why we need cash is we don't have an agreed upon understanding the value of the thing we're exchanging, and so, well, that can be a problem. But if we have this like rigorously trained population, and again, there will still be some variations of judgment. I'm not saying that won't be the case, but what I'm arguing is that they'll be small enough that the so, for example, right, many on the left today will say, "Isn't it outrageous that, like, some millionaire might buy this multi-million-dollar yacht, which in theory could have fed, tens of thousands of starving people? How is that more valuable than people?" And those kinds of moral arguments, which I think have some merit to them, would be very different under this context, because within a properly constructed virtue system, that would just be seen as an absurd expression of avarice and pride, and it would just not be acceptable at all for anyone to do that, and this just wouldn't be a part of the conversation.
Okay, so to see if I can rephrase that a little bit, it sounds like what you're saying is that the temptation for people to spend money on certain things itself could be the red flag that your society is transitioning away from the virtuous way in which it starts, right?
Yes.
So So the proclivity for somebody to go, yeah, maybe it's a good idea if I buy a yacht. Like that itself is the red flag, whether you have like an imperial society or a complex global society or whatever. The red flag should be what do individuals feel like they have licenses to buy and sell? And so I guess we've got two perspectives on it. So I've got like the global perspective on it, and then you've got kind of like the individual perspective on it. And so there's like two ways we can kind of look for these red flags.
Right. And also, too, tying this back to cash, exchange rates won't be as difficult as one might think because being properly educated within this conceptual space, the values of things will be pretty clearly defined. So it won't be very hard for people to understand relative values in exchange.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So.
Okay. I mean, that about covers the topics that I had prepared. So do you have any closing or anything you want to say?
Well, no, I think we're done. But I think we covered a lot of ground here, Logos. I think there's a few really pithy summaries that I gave thanks to your prompts, which I think will be helpful for future listeners.
All right. Well, I had fun. So
Well, thank you, Logos. This is Ty Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.